to say, there's your train.
Long before we were hitting the road, we were hitting the rails. Travel by train was the mode of transportation across the country, and Amarillo wouldn't be Amarillo without it.
It's not just here in large part due to the railroad, it's here because of the railroad. Cattlemen came in. To get dry goods, they had to go down to Colorado City. To get the cattle to market, they drove the cattle up to Dodge City, Kansas, to ship them out on the railhead.
The railroads were soon headed to our neck of the woods. First headed to Panhandle and Washburn, and eventually Amarillo. The first Fort Worth and Denver passenger train arrived in Amarillo in March of 1888 from Clarendon.
The railroad started out carrying people, but then freight also played a big part. The railroad, as the Panhandle developed, they shipped millions of head of cattle out of the Panhandle. But in the early years, they found that there was such a need for goods here in the Panhandle. They would take those stock cars, and they weren't bringing them back here empty. They were bringing them back loaded with goods for the merchants, the stores, the things that people needed.
With all of the passenger and cargo traffic Amarillo had, it needed a place to wrangle it into one.
Well, the depot originally was built here to service as a hub for the Panhandle of Texas. It was a major component of both passenger traffic, commercial freight, and private freight.
Jerry Danforth, the director of facilities with the city of Amarillo, likes to call it the original UPS.
That was the way both commercial freight and private freight was moved in and out of Amarillo. You've got to keep in mind, interstates didn't exist, even state highways didn't exist at the time, so it was a critical part of the infrastructure and the development in the Panhandle of Texas. A lot of people are obviously aware of the impact of beef across the United States. At one time, almost 80% of all beef consumed in the United States came out of Amarillo, Texas. Obviously, we weren't driving cattle all the way to Chicago, so the railroad was a key component of that.
Roth says rail travel grew in Amarillo until around the 1950s.
The peak in passenger ridership occurred actually, I think, in 1929, right before the Great Depression. With the Depression, people didn't have money, and so they couldn't go places, so ridership on the passenger trains just went way down. The railroad still kept service, but it was World War II brought a huge spike, but it never, in my understanding, never reached the peak that it had been at.
Roth says at the same time, troops came home and more people got good paying jobs and started buying cars, leading us into the great American road trip.
When World War II ends, and you got these guys coming back with a little jingle in their pocket, and Hollywood was great and big, all of a sudden everybody wanted to take a vacation trip out to Hollywood.
And they did it by getting their kicks on Route 66. Dubbed the Mother Road, it was established on November 11th of 1926 and spans 2,448 miles from Chicago to LA.
And Route 66 became the main corridor to go on vacations.
178 miles of that corridor crosses through the Texas Panhandle, and here in the Yellow City.
Route 66 brought a lot more to this sleepy little town that was Amarillo than would have been here if it wasn't for Route 66.
People travel from all across the country to see what was offered on the route, opening up Amarillo to the culture of the country and to the world. Livingston says this is what and does continue to make Route 66 special to this day.
And we have the world coming through Amarillo just because of Route 66. I mean, we also have the interstate system, but that's not what brings people from Czechoslovakia and France and Spain. Those people are coming because they're traveling Route 66, and we're right there in the heart of it.
The heart of it is actually not far off. The midpoint of Route 66 is only about 50 miles to the west of Amarillo.
But what happens is a lot of people will take it in bites, and because we're right in the middle, it's a great place to start off. And because we also have Rick Husband International Airport, not only do people fly into Chicago and travel, but they also fly into here and travel.
Things started to change once President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act.
When you see the Route 66 corridor, which is essentially the boulevard and then down the middle of downtown and then, out 6th Street, that died.
Many cities didn't make the move to the interstates and folded up.
I think they were stunned, and they didn't expect that radical loss of people stopping. They no longer had to stop at the red lights you stop at the red lights, you realize you gotta go to the bathroom, or you realize, oh, I'm hungry or whatever. And just being forced to stop creates a lot of commerce and industry. And that didn't happen. And so, yeah, I think people were really shocked in those towns that they didn't have the business.
Though there are now plenty of ghost towns along Route 66, Amarillo didn't suffer the same fate.
And we're really lucky that we didn't do that. We actually adapted, and we thrive. We're growing because of the interstate.
From the moment Wilbur and Orville Wright took flight in 1903, the national interest in aviation took off, including in Amarillo. Fixed at Julian Boulevard in Travis, Bivens Field became Amarillo's first airfield.
Bivens Airport was started in 1919, and it was good for several years until that addition was platted for city development. At that point, Bivens Field was closed, and the city of Amarillo became aware that they needed a municipal airport.
One bond election later, and Amarillo had purchased a lot of land in the East Ridge addition for its new airport. But they needed an airport manager.
The competition was between Otis Williams and Harold English. Otis Williams got the job. Well, Harold English's feelings were hurt, and he came out and purchased land on the way to Panhandle.
On that land, he built his own airfield, English Field, which later became Amarillo Air Terminal.
People said, why would anybody put an airport halfway to Panhandle?
It turned out to be cementing Amarillo's future in aviation. At the time English was starting his airfield, the beginnings of commercial air traffic were just emerging in the country.
And so we began to have very early airlines that are emerging, and here Amarillo has emerged as an airport. The anticipation was that these airlines would have passenger service to municipal.
But English and his brother-in-law Thomas Oxnard had financial connections to what Scammahorn says was a financial wizard in New York City.
These airlines flew right over municipal and landed right here. The only thing that municipal could find out was the services are better at English Field.
Eventually, municipal closed because there was no commercial traffic.
We have these small airlines beginning to start, and we have Western Express and several other airlines. Okay, and as these mergers came and went, and these passenger lines began to grow, there eventually became the merger that would become Trans World Airlines,
which made major stops right here in Amarillo. In 1942, Amarillo Army Airfield was activated and was just adjacent to English Field. It was one of the largest installations in Western Technical Training Command, training crews and mechanics on the B-17. But a breath of life was given to it in 1951, when it was reactivated as Amarillo Air Force Base.
Being a strategic air command base, we flew B-52s around the periphery of these United States, and to fly B-52s you need a long, solid runway. Consequently, our runway is about 3 miles long, and it's 12 feet deep of reinforced concrete. And I know from the airport office that there is not a plane in the world, an aircraft in the world, that we cannot handle on this runway.
Because of that runway, Amarillo also became a backup airport for NASA's space shuttle.
In the occasions when the shuttle would land in California and have to get back to Florida and was weathered out of a military base, they could just land here. And that happened 2 times in the last 2 years that the shuttle was flying.
The base was deactivated in December of 1968. Afterwards, the city of Amarillo took control of part of the land and built Amarillo International Airport, moving operations from Amarillo Air Terminal.
Booster ignition.
But our aviation history doesn't stop there. It expands into space. Some of our most notable are Rick Husband, an Amarillo High School grad. He and the rest of his Space Shuttle Columbia crew were killed as their shuttle disintegrated during re-entry in 2003. Paul Lockhart, a Tascosa grad who flew 2 shuttle missions, and Holly Ridings, also a Tascosa grad who was named the first woman to be Chief Flight Director at NASA.
We continue to contribute, and it started just with the pioneers who came here and said, let's fly.